I'm Christopher Lydon. This is Open Source on how to see the Israeli-American war on Iran, on how to understand it, maybe even escape it. The writer and historian Daniel Immerwahr is our guest. With the essential qualifications, Daniel, starting with your own firm grip on the history here, and a taste also for irony, tragedy, absurdity, in your own freewheeling and unpredictable style. Start where you will, Daniel. In the third week of this undeclared war, describe what you are seeing.
Yeah, in some ways, what I'm seeing is a thing that the United States, or at least its leaders, have contemplated for a long time. There's been decades of fantasizing about doing this, about bombing Iran. Mm-hmm. We know that various presidents have considered it, and it seems like some of them really wanted it, but it hasn't happened. So, I mean, one question that people are asking is like, why is Trump doing this? Another question to ask is, why haven't other presidents done this?
Well, let's talk about it. And I'm counting on you as a historian, although I've read a lot of the history myself, starting with Steve Kinz's wonderful book, All the Shah's Men. You write that Americans have been freaking out about Iran since 1979. But it's just as true to say that Iranians have been freaking out about the United States since 1953, when the CIA and the British intelligence overthrew Iran's Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, the popular nationalist who had broken the British Empire's grip on Iranian oil. And the next step in the American overthrow was the Shah of Iran, who served until another revolution threw him out. Review those dates, 1953, 1979, and this war year of 2026, and connect them.
You're right to ask for that, because from the U.S. perspective, or at least from the perspective of presidents, the story is often Iran had a revolution, and suddenly out of nowhere, the country was taken over by people who regarded the United States as the great Satan. And, how could we possibly tolerate this, et cetera, et cetera. But you're absolutely right. From Iran's perspective, the story starts in 1953, and the story starts when the United States instigated a coup that overthrew the government of Mohammad Mossadegh, and that then took someone, the Shah of Iran, who had been a constitutional monarch, and turned him into an actual monarch. Not just a monarch, but a dictator.
With a rough, tough police state
forcing
his rule.
In retrospect, it wasn't, the worst of all that we know. But what did he do? He sold Iranian oil to the United States. He used it to buy weapons to beef up his police. And when people dissented, his guards threw them in prison, exiled them, or shot them in the street. That's decades of Iranian history. So much so that in 1979, the overthrow of the Shah didn't happen as a coup, just orchestrated by a few people. It was absolutely a popular revolution. And how you measure these things can differ a little, but it's one of the most popular revolutions ever that we know about. Millions of people participated from across the political spectrum. I mean, it wasn't just Islamists, it was Jews, it was hippies, it was liberals, and they were all absolutely determined to see the Shah go.
When did that student uprising morph into a theocracy, Daniel?
Very quickly, and from the perspective of a lot of people who participated in it, unexpectedly. The uprising had coalesced around Ayatollah Khomeini as like a central figure. Part of the way that worked was that he was sort of a revolutionary icon, like a Che Guevara. He was really old. He'd been in exile for a long time. Most of the people who participated in the revolution, including other Ayatollahs, were not expecting and not on board with the fact that Iran would become a semi-theocracy under the supreme leadership of Ayatollah Khomeini. But revolutionary situations allow for and create a lot of malleability, and he turned out to be a very old man, really good at, getting his thugs in the street, consolidating power, just quickly changing facts on the ground, to the point where a lot of people who participated in the revolution end up feeling horribly betrayed by it.
That history, it seems to be, is critical, partly because the thread in the whole time has been a mix of motives that cannot be talked about, cannot be named. The Brits didn't say, we're here to take your oil. And we didn't say, we're here to bring you freedom. But the critical elements boil down to oil, which has been Iran's treasure, but also imperial overreach, which the United States learned from the Brits. And then, it seems to me, it's Bibi Netanyahu's personal, he now says, 40-year dream that Israel, to be safe forever, must sooner or later conquer Iran and break it up, ideally, as now, with the military force coming from the United States.
Yeah.
It's an almost unspeakable history, one that can't be talked about politely or on front page of the New York Times.
And Eisenhower, who was the one who ordered the coup in 1953, was quite clear about that. He said, look, we have to do this covertly. And the reason we have to do this covertly is we can't say out loud what we're doing. All our influence in the Middle East would collapse if we admitted to this. Now, of course, were Iranians confused about what happened? Not really. It was widely understood that the United States had done this, but it was also important to U.S. leaders to deny it. This isn't the kind of thing we do, or at least this isn't the kind of thing we admit to doing. It wasn't until 2000 that a U.S. official, in this case the Secretary of State, finally just admitted things that Iranians had known for decades, which is that the United States had been behind the coup.
What do we see in the persistence of the war, which has not gone well for any of the principals, has not satisfied any of their goals in the first few weeks?
I mean, I wonder about that in the case of Trump, because Trump's goals are far from clear, or at least they keep changing. I mean, one of the really striking things that differentiates Trump from his predecessors, who have also had grand ambitions, is his kind of indifference to outcomes, right? It seems so clear in Iran that, will this be a revolution? Maybe. Will this lead to the end of the Islamic Republic? Perhaps. Will this just lead to another Islamic Republic, decapitated and with someone who is Trump installed? Perhaps that too. He seems incredibly comfortable with any number of these things in a way that really differentiates him from George W. Bush and his wars in the Middle East.
Yeah. You make Donald Trump the very center of this whole misbegotten project, if I may. It has elements of incoherence that run through almost everything Trump does, but it's more than that. You think this is not only his war, but that he might, in his own vision, be winning it for a notion of himself as emperor, an emperor without an empire. That's a tricky idea, but without an empire to restrain him, to hold him accountable, to be a measurable outcome here. Explain that.
So there's this incredible moment when, during the Iraq War, during George W. Bush's Iraq War, it wasn't going well, and Bush kept investing more energy into keeping the occupation going, and he was obeying what members of his administration called the Pottery Barn Rule.
Right.
If you break it, you own it. And he had certainly broken it, so now he owned it, and the occupation stretched on. And in 2007, so just as the surge was happening, someone interviewed Donald Trump about this. And Trump said, I have no idea. He couldn't fathom what Bush was doing. He's like, just who cares? Who cares what happens in Iraq? Declare victory and leave. Get out of there and say that you won. So you went bankrupt, call it a business triumph. And that seems to me Donald Trump's understanding of how this might go. I mean, in fact, he already has declared victory. Day one was a victory for Trump. That's in some sense true because Trump doesn't have a concern for the chessboard. He's very improvisatory, right? He's like, well, they said we shouldn't do this. Let's just do it, see what happens. Yeah. And if it doesn't work out, Trump has been absolutely clear throughout his entire political career since the 80s that U.S. presidents care too much what happens in foreign countries. And they should just be okay with things not going well because that's over there, that's not here.
Say you won and come home was George Aiken's famous advice to Lyndon Johnson. Aiken was the senator from Vermont. Early on in the war in Vietnam, he said, come home. And Lyndon Johnson later said, George Aiken had it right. In Donald Trump's case, it's a lot more complicated. And in our own psyches, it's more complicated. How to Hide an Empire was the book that made you famous, Daniel Immerwahr. Very sharp-eyed take on our very own American empire in denial. The cover on your book, which I still treasure, showed the familiar outline image of 48 contiguous states. It's the iconic USA that leaves out all of our overseas conquests and possessions all around the globe, from Guantanamo to Guam, you could say. It's been empire all along. You write in the New Yorker this week that Donald Trump is in a twist on empire and anti-empire. His neurotic fantasy all along has been to be that emperor, but without the empire to restrain him. Talk about a double bind.
Yeah, I'd put that a little differently. I mean, so Trump has inherited an empire in just the obvious sense that the United States has 5 inhabited territories. It has hundreds of military bases outside of its borders. We think 750, but we're not sure because the military won't tell us. So just in a strict territorial sense, the United States, is an empire, and it has been since day one. He's had an interesting relationship to that empire. On the one hand, he's been uncomfortable with many aspects of it. Can we close the bases? Can we sell Puerto Rico? He's had moments of imperial ambition. Can we seize Greenland?
Can we add Canada?
Yeah, can we take Canada? I think what's becoming increasingly clear is that when we talk not about empire, which is the sort of characteristics of a country, but imperialism, which is the animating ideology, that's actually not the right diagnosis for Trump, or not the main diagnosis for Trump, because what distinguishes Trump from past presidents, they all have pursued power and strength, et cetera, so that's not new. But Trump's preferred form of power, time and again, is the kind of power that doesn't seek control. He's not trying to control regions. He's not trying to transform them. He's just sort of, doing a hit and run. And he's curious about what will happen next. But throughout Trump's political career, he has consistently said the idea that American interests are everywhere at stake, the idea that the United States should govern world affairs, should police the planet, all of that is anathema to him. He wants to be a competitor, not the sort of emperor of the whole thing, right? He wants to be a team, not the league commissioner or the umpire. He imagines a different role for the United States. It's certainly still a violent role, but it's less based on any form of aspiration for control or hegemony.
There are MAGA faithful resurrecting that notion, trying to remind Trump that he stood for not engagement abroad, but disengagement, and we'll see how that comes out. But you've been exploring Trump's head in ways that I don't remember others doing. You've written a lot about his fixation on President McKinley, for example, and his tariffs in the 1890s. Also about Trump's own adventures in Japan and in global business, more than I realized. What is the burden of all that he's bringing to the war in Iran?
I think Japan is a really good example. So in U.S. history, Japan is often mentioned by defenders of U.S. power as a really good example of this going well. So in World War II, the United States comprehensively napalmed and then nuked Japan. And yet after World War II, the United States occupied Japan, invested a lot into rebuilding the Japanese economy, and that went really well. I mean, just on an economic standpoint, Japan had a booming economic miracle to the point where its firms were able to outcompete U.S. firms in electronics and car manufacturing. So people who say that U.S. hegemony has been a good thing for the world say, look at Japan. Japan has done very well under the U.S. umbrella. That actually is like Trump's main case. So he came up in the 1980s very much at a time when it seemed like the Japanese economy might undermine the U.S. economy, taking U.S. jobs, et cetera. And his first debut, on the political scene was an editorial he published in 1987 complaining that the United States was spending too much on allies like Japan, and they were free riders.
Were they ripping us off?
They're ripping us off. Exactly right. A lot of Trump's early economic moves were against Japan. The Japanese would buy up Rockefeller Center. He would buy up the Plaza Hotel. And so he was like competing for real estate with Japan, but also enormously frustrated with his Japanese competitors. And he kept feeling like U.S. hegemony had underwritten Japanese success at the expense of people like him. So this turned Trump into a critic of U.S. hegemony, not like, I am, like a left-wing critic who worry about its effects on the world, but a right-wing critic who worry that it's not paying out enough for the United States. I mean, Trump is inconsistent or inconstant in all kinds of ways, but that is he just keeps coming back to that.
That is serious stuff. It's not just inconsistency. I mean, it's blatant contradiction, and the man is at war, for crying out loud.
Well, he never was a peaceful man, but his vision of how the United States and when the United States should go to war has always been different from, the presidents that preceded him. They had a kind of, there's a large system. The United States wants to be, as Joe Biden consistently said, the United States belongs at the head of the table. And our job is to manage things, and the United States benefits enormously from that. Trump's view has been the United States doesn't benefit from this at all. One of the most extraordinary things he said was when he was campaigning in 2016. And he said, look, if we're going to police the planet, we should be paid for it. And I thought, oh my God, every other president would just think, We're making so much on policing the planet. This is one of the enormous benefits that the United States has, is it gets to police the planet in its favor. But Trump doesn't see it like that. He always sees hegemony as an unbearable burden.
Right. It's always that ripoff. It sounds petulant. It sounds completely childish and sort of, again, nothing he's going to live by. But is it affecting his conduct of this war?
Yeah, absolutely. Because every president who's sort of gone through that thought process of maybe we should bomb Iran. I don't know. They seem like they're building nuclear weapons. Maybe they're sponsoring terrorism. We've got the military capacity to do it. I'd rather like to do it. It might be very politically popular. Why can't I do it? The answer has always been there's a larger chessboard. And that if you attack Iran, that might destabilize Iraq. That might be bad for the Gulf allies. And that ultimately will be not good for U.S. control in the Middle East. The failure to attack Iran hasn't been modest. It's been ambition. That other presidents have been much more ambitious and had a broader sense of their goals. That's the part of U.S. power that Trump has never liked. He likes the threats, he likes the planes, he likes the bombs, but he doesn't like this sort of broad-minded sense of, subtle control over large areas, over large timescales. He's just like, no, let's just bomb them, see what happens. I don't care. I'm okay with the consequences.
This is fascinating, Daniel Immerwahr, if I may say. I mean, I feel as if I'm listening to you inside Trump's head, but there are several people in there talking and arguing with each other. People say, the person who talks to him last, but which self of Donald Trump is got the upper hand in his head is really the question.
Yeah, so I think there are things that Trump is wildly mercurial about. So there are areas where he could do one thing one day and another the other. And then I think there are larger shaping commitments that he has. So the way I read it is the rejection of U.S. hegemony, the right-wing attack on U.S. hegemony, that's been core to who he is. But that leads, one argument that he was making was, I'm going to be a more peaceful president because I don't believe American interests are at stake all over the planet. I'm not George W. Bush. I'm not going to get into these crusading wars to remake the Middle East because I ultimately don't care. And so that's one version of Trump. It turns out that Trump's minimal commitments, rather than making him a peaceful president, have actually lowered the barriers to war. And that not caring has also made it really possible for him to enter a major war on a seeming impulse. Like his spokesperson said that the reason that Trump has joined this war is because he had a quote unquote feeling that Iran would attack. A feeling. And there we go. We're off to the races.
You make him out as a sort of very ambitious global pirate, as in Venezuela, for example. But I love your line that at the core, he's a hit-and-run driver, not a hegemon.
That's right. Yeah, he's a bully with a bomber. And even in Venezuela, that's interesting. So on the one hand, he did something really audacious to capture the head of state. On the other hand, did he want to remake Venezuela? He had all this line about how awful Maduro was, and Maduro had orchestrated the trafficking of drugs to the United States. He'd sent savage and murderous gangs to the United States. So you think, oh, well, that's bad. How does he feel about the vice president who is going to be the acting president? Well, for her, he says, well, she's quite gracious. She can stay. On the one hand, it's audacious, but it's also modest, right? He didn't try in the end to remake Venezuela. He just was he just fired a guy.
It's also criminal. He walks in and takes Venezuela's oil. If you came into my house and took my sofa, I'd call the cops.
If you're taking me as defending Trump here, please don't. No, he's absolutely reckless. It's terrifying.
Where's the rest of the world in watching this? Oh, by the way, he comes home and says, I just took Venezuela.
Well, he didn't just take Venezuela. So, compare it to what George W. Bush did in Iraq. Both of those were concerned about the leader of the country. Trump goes in, he's like, okay, well, leader's in handcuffs, I'm done. And George W. Bush was like, oh, no, we're going to democratize Iraq. We're going to remake the Middle East. Iran is our stretch goal. Those are very different sets of ambitions. What we're seeing now is, you might imagine that Trump's more restricted ambitions would, he wouldn't get into crusades and wars. Now we're seeing that actually his restrained ambitions means that he has a kind of blithe indifference that actually gives him a whole different kind of danger. You're right, it is criminal and it's terrifying.
It's interesting. The arguments around this war, and there haven't been enough of them, without any benefit of congressional debate on them, the arguments have been subdued, but they begin to spill out, even this week, in the upper ranks of the Trump administration. Joe Kent, whom I'd never heard of, was director of the National Counterterrorism Institute, a significant piece of our intelligence apparatus. He was a MAGA guy from the start, but he resigned his job this week with an incendiary letter to the president. He said Iran posed no imminent threat to the U.S. He claimed that American media, high-ranking Israeli officials, and influential Israeli lobbyists deployed a misinformation campaign and had sowed pro-war sentiments to encourage a war with Iran. And this has almost ignited a MAGA war inside the old Trump constituency about, have we lost our way? Has he lost his way?
Yeah.
The whole idea of Iran as a threat to the United States was a lie. This is Joe Kent speaking. And it's the same tactic that the Israelis used to draw us into the disastrous Iraq war that cost our nation the lives of thousands of our best men and women.
Part of it is right. So did Iran pose an immediate threat to the United States? I mean, Trump's line had always been, we won't go to war unless someone poses a direct threat, unless our interests are directly at stake. Is this a case of that? It's hard to read it as such. It's hard to know what immediate threat Iran posed after, nearly 5 decades of this kind of hostility, and after Trump, by his own account, had obliterated Iran's nuclear facilities. So that part of the letter makes a lot of sense. Then there's another part of the letter that suggests that this is all a kind of Israeli plot. I sense some sort of anti-Semitic overtones there. I don't think it's true that Israel hoodwinked the United States into the Iraq War. Israel was pretty clear. They wanted the United States to go to war with Iran back then. They thought the United States was invading the wrong country. This time, Netanyahu and Trump are aligned, and it's clear that Israel wanted this war, and it's clear that Israel has done a lot to try to induce the United States into joining it in this war, including perhaps starting the war and just kind of as a fait accompli and getting the United States to sort of join along. That's a real possibility. However, I'm a little skeptical of the notion that Trump had no independent interest, because there's a nice piece by Matthew Schmitz in Compact that just points out all of the time since the 1980s when Trump has said we should invade Iran. So Netanyahu has wanted this for 40 years, but so has Trump.
Even our Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, has got hung up on this question of, did Netanyahu want it more than Trump did, or did he want it sooner, or who cued whom, or who's responding to what here? Can you rule on that?
No, that requires a sort of insight into conversations that are not going to get declassified for a long time. Look, it is obvious that Israel has wanted this very badly, but it appeals to Trump too. I mean, Trump is the guy who rips up the deal, does the thing in spite of his advisors, defies the adults in the room, and acts on sort of pure violent desire. This is a really good example of all those Trumpian qualities.
And then what about the political minds inside Iran, full of their own glorious myths of an ancient Persian empire, but they're also full of modern memories of persecution at the hands of Russians and Brits and Americans. Their definition of victory has been defined as simply surviving as a regime, not just as a regime, as a nation of 90+ million people and a vast mass of land. I don't want to make you a military second-guesser, but what do you make of that piece of the Iranian mind?
I don't think you have to have sort of deep insight into Iranian minds to understand that, yeah, of course, Iran wants to survive this war, and the Iranian government would like to survive intact. In some perverse way, this war makes it very clear why some in Iran wanted to develop their nuclear capabilities to the point where they could be. My read is that Iran wasn't trying for an intact nuclear weapon. I think that would trigger too many reactions, but was looking to be a very close to the cusp kind of state in the way that other governments are. And part of the reason is to deter exactly this kind of thing. So, I mean, I sense Iran as being in a security bind, which is beefing up its security too much, is likely to trigger this kind of chastisement, but not beefing up its security enough is likely to make it vulnerable to this kind of chastisement. I mean, in retrospect, Iran miscalculated. This event does actually highlight a bind that I think any Iranian leader would be in, regardless of ideology.
Who could tell the imperious principles in this war, in Iran, in Israel, and in the United States, that they're failing rather spectacularly, not only on the ground, but in mind, in their preparations, in their thinking, in their anticipation. They're discrediting themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the most dangerous aspects of it is that, look, we know what it sounded like when George W. Bush thought about bombing Iran. He really wanted to do it. He regarded Iran as an existential threat. And he was, by all accounts, military strikes were on the table. In his memoir, Decision Points, he tells you why he didn't do it. And he's like, well, there was a national intelligence estimate, and it suggested that, the story that I wanted to tell about Iran's nuclear program wasn't really right, and that was going to go public, and I was going to look terrible, and I was going to look terrible in the eyes of my allies. So there's all this concern about what others might think, what allies might think, how hard it might be to pull coalitions together if you completely defy allies again after having done it once with Iraq. Trump just seems completely allergic to allies, immune to this kind of concern. And that makes you really nervous. I mean, maybe the MAGA base can pull Trump back in the way that seems like might have contributed to what happened in Minneapolis. But boy, it's hard to tell. He just seems to be kind of impervious to the normal constraints that have held presidents back and that have brought them back from moments of excess.
I wonder, you have to wonder about a war that doesn't seem to be serving anybody's purpose and could be really, really bad for the whole wide world.
Yeah.
Where do you see, or where do you look to see pressures rising to end this war, Daniel? Tell me I'm right to suppose that it cannot go on forever.
I mean, it cannot go on forever. Of course, it can't go on forever. I mean, look, it does not seem likely that Iran is going to mount enough military force to end this war in any sense on the battlefield. I could be wrong about that. It could be that Iran has been holding back its good missiles until it burns through all the interceptor missiles, and then it's going to start firing the real stuff, and that's going to make a huge difference. That's a real possibility. But it just seems like the U.S. has such military superiority, which means that the United States is going to have to be, in some ways, internally checked.
It has confident military superiority if it's to come to an absolutely terminal shootout. But short of that, without more war, what power do we have?
That depends on what you mean by we. I mean, Iran can imperil U.S. allies, but that also requires Trump recognizing them and treating them as allies, which, historically has been a question mark. My greatest hope for a sharp change comes from the MAGA base, from the fight within MAGA about whether this is real Trumpism or betrayal. I think that's where the most political motion is. And it's really unclear how that's going to play out.
Do you want to credit that, I don't know what to call it, a pretense or a possibility that Trump in his heart is an anti-war guy? He wants to end wars, not start them, he's famously said. And yet, in this case, he clearly started it.
I mean, when we get into this level of Trumpology, it just feels like you're like psychoanalyzing a child, and you're like, well, what could convince Timmy to do this? Trump does have a story that he likes to tell about himself, which is that because he's not a hegemony guy, he is therefore a peace guy. And that's empirically untrue. I mean, you cannot make that argument anymore. But could Trump be induced to embrace that side of himself? I won the war, I ended the war, I declared victory, I left. That might be some version of how it ends, and the question is when.
My notion on stopping the war is to ventilate the history that we've just flown over, and people like you who know it and realize it's a many-sided story all sit together for a month in Geneva or wherever they want and talk it through, get to know each other. These people don't know each other very well.
Yeah, I'm a little skeptical about the possibility of historians to sort of lecture people into...
You're one of them, and people could take it, I think, from you, and a consensus of people like you, Daniel.
Yeah, I mean, look, here's the thing to note is that the basics of U.S.-Iranian history... So, by the way, the best place to go for this kind of stuff is not me, is a book called America and Iran by John Ghazvinian. And the story he tells is absolutely tragic, and it talks about the coup and how it leads to the revolution and all that kind of thing. But here's the thing. The main contours of that have been completely known. I mean, this is not like secret stuff. It's just that people in power have a way of ignoring it, re-narrating it, talking over it, which from a historian's perspective is enormously frustrating, partly because you just want to shriek. You're like, Trump, one of the reasons why Iran even debatably has the nuclear capacity that it has is that you tore up the deal and that like you released Iran from limits. But yeah, sometimes you feel like you're shouting in the wind.
I have not read John Gazvinian, but I will. You have, where would he hope this deep historical reexamination would take us?
It's not a particularly hopeful book, although the one moment that you kind of raise your eyebrows in is the Obama administration. Even then, it's a kind of tragic and ambivalent story. But
he was the one who said, we're reaching out if you'll let go of the fist.
Yeah. So one of the first things Obama did, he did it in his inaugural address, was he addressed the Muslim world like 12 minutes into his inaugural address. And he said, if you will unclench your fist, we will extend our hand. And then he seemed serious about it, and he pursued the Iran deal. He was just fighting like so many interests within his own administration. His Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, seemed completely uninterested in this. Bibi Netanyahu got brought into Congress to like try to torpedo the deal. Even the Obama administration like ended up just sanctioning Iran with really aggressive sanctions when promising talks just like stalled a little bit. Obama came back in his second term after the sanctions had taken a really horrible humanitarian toll in Iran and was able to kind of redo the deal. Well, now they had a new Secretary of State, John Kerry. And so you just see like, that's like a moment of possibility, but boy, that was hard. And the deal lasts for like 3 years before Trump rips it up.
You're explaining exactly why the founders in the Constitution said that Congress and only Congress can declare war, and that these things ought to be studied and argued and revealed before they happen. We've got to have those hearings, but we also need, I think, the historians' real session on educating ourselves. It's amazing to me how little all of us know about the history, the myths, the lies, the outright propaganda and misinformation that we're swimming in.
Look, I mean, I would say this is a fundamental condition of the United States is because it operates the world's most powerful military and has not largely kept its hands to itself over the last couple decades, that we're constantly in this position within the United States of our government towers over many parts of the world, and yet our officials know very little about the world that they purport to be governing. I mean, it's just a massive asymmetry of information. I mean, that's how power often operates, right? Is that you have power, you have the privilege not to know, not to care. And we're just seeing it in such a profound way.
Do we hold the standard media responsible for that?
Yes and no. I mean, I think there's also a limit to like how much the media can do and how much like the average, in a normal world where one country wasn't like lording over the rest of the planet, it would be okay for people in the United States not to have deep knowledge about faraway places, right? They could have normal amounts of knowledge. And we're just not in that world. So we're kind of like constantly in this position where we're like, this country votes to elect a guy who's like, we're going to bomb Iran. And then like half the people voting for him are like, where? What? Why?
Yeah, that sounds like Mark Twain saying that war is God's way of teaching Americans geography.
Yeah. It's not originally Twain, but what's interesting is that you can't say that about other countries. There's a distinctive feature of the United States' global military reach that makes that true. There was this moment a couple of years ago, I think it was in the first Trump administration, where there was an incident and some U.S. soldiers were killed in Niger. And then, like, in Congress, representatives and senators were like, we had soldiers in Niger? Why? And I was like, you didn't know. Like, whoa, that is an incredible thing about the U.S. military, is that it is so extensive. Like, it's got bases like everywhere around the planet, and its operations are so extensive that even the people who are ostensibly like knowledge of the classified information are still just confused about the basics.
I think Marco Rubio is still wildly confused about the basics, as well as about his principles.
Yeah. There was a great picture where Trump is like explaining, reason number 5 that, he'd given that day of like why the United States is doing this. And you can just see like Rubio with his head in his hands. I mean, just like exhausted, even being on Trump's side, just trying to like keep up with the like head spinning, set of pretexts and thin justifications.
Little Marco, after all. Daniel Immerwahr, this is fun, and I hope it's just the beginning of a further conversation around all of these things, especially the history. But we love your work in The New Yorker. We enjoy talking with you. Let's do it again.
Sounds great. I'll look forward to that.
Daniel Immerwahr is a professor of history at Northwestern University and a contributing writer at The New Yorker magazine. He had a hardcover bestseller in How to Hide an Empire, Geography and Power in the Greater United States. Here at Open Source, we count on listener support. If you haven't done your part yet, please go to radioopensource.org/donate and pitch in to keep the world's first and longest-running podcast going strong. We're proud to be a founding member of Hub and Spoke, a Boston-based collective of independent voices in podcasting. Check the range of our interests from art to technology, from politics to history at hubspokeaudio.org. You'll be glad you did, and thank you.